I wanted to today set the stage for our conversation. And before I do that, I will just uh, say that I'm Sharon Bland. I am the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer at Montgomery College. I've been with the college for 3 years now, and I'm very focused on um, making sure that our college has infused equity inclusion throughout all of our practices, teaching and learning, administrative units, and as a participant in the countywide, statewide, and national conversation around equity inclusion. I'd like to introduce Dr. Andre Brown, who, along with Professor Sonia Pruitt, helped with our discussion of our Let's Talk Part 1, and we're just going to give you a brief overview of that. So Dr. Brown is a professor of psychology at Montgomery College, and his career highlights include serving as a professor at many other colleges and universities prior to his work at Montgomery College. He's also served as director of community-based mental health, educational and training facilities, a research fellow, and also as a member of several national boards. So with that, Dr. Brown, would you start?
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everybody's doing pretty good today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bland, for the introduction. And I just wanted to, take a few minutes to kind of provide some feedback from the last session that we had, things that I've seen, things that I've heard from the community that was engaged, and also kind of think about where we're moving and heading in the near future. And so, first of all, I was very excited and encouraged by the dialogue that we engaged in Let's Talk One. I think we had, a good representation and cross-section of the MC community, and also a few folks that were, and we say community, people at the school and people a little bit outside of that. But what was most encouraging was the fact that even though we're in the middle of a global pandemic on multiple fronts, from COVID-19 and also from a lot of the racialized violence that we're seeing, that our community was able to come together and engage in and start and continue a dialogue that's important to us around listening, understanding, and trying to figure out how we can best manage and support each other through this process. And as we saw in the first call, there was many different perspectives. There was a sense of people trying to, express some hurts and pains that they've had in the past. And also people saying, I'm aware of what's going on, but also some folks saying, I'm trying to figure this whole thing out. And I think what we see is that everybody's really figuring it out. Even if we think we know, things are changing on such a daily basis where it's this constant onslaught. And so even from George Floyd, from our last call, we had his funeral, there was other calls of actions. There's also been several other incidents of murder towards Black men in those last, I think it's been 2 weeks since we had our call on today. And so since then, right now, Atlanta is turned all the way up because of an incident that just happened where a young man was shot by police at a Wendy's parking lot. And so what it also lets me know is that we are still in the midst of something that's going to take a while to figure out and to put a stop to it. But we are actively engaged in it. And I think that's critical to, maintain and keep perspective on. That it's not over, it's still in the middle of it. This is not a short-term fix, but we can be committed to making sure that we're part of the solution. The other thing that stood out is that we have to be very, very careful as we're working together in thinking about these issues and acting on them, right? Because it's not just a talk group. It should move into some type of action. That we remain focused on listening to the narratives that are being created. So one of the things we know is that oftentimes language is used to keep people in certain spaces. So we'll hear things around, defunding the police, right? As if there's a notion of there's no money that should be given to police as compared to reallocating resources for the most efficient, effective way of maintaining safety. We're also hearing terms around, you know, even with who we're talking about today, caring, right? The notion of a caring, which is not anything new. It's the sense of oftentimes people over-exacerbate the situation for their advantage, and there's trigger points that will cause people to panic. So a lot of the things that we're doing, what we're hearing is calls for panic and not calls for thoughtful engagement and dialogue. And so we want to make sure that as we're working and we're talking and communicating with each other, even when we're upset, we may say, well, I disagree, but our disagreement doesn't mean that it need to be followed with a threat, right? And we see at times where we've gotten feedback where it's like, oh, this is a great, and me personally as well, this is a great conversation, or you're just like them. And I'm like, well, who's them? What is that? Talk to me and understand where I'm coming from as compared to put me in a box of what we think should be or where people want to place us. And so that's important for us as colleagues, as a community of scholars, of learners, and activists. And I really want us to start thinking about ourselves as activists, right? There's no benefit for us to engage in a good conversation and then there's no movement. That's not liberation. That's not social justice. That's what we've always done, which is engage in rhetoric, and that's it. So part of, and you hear a little bit more from me moving forward in the dialogue, but that was some of the thoughts that I had from the beginning. But I really want to encourage us, stay engaged, be thoughtful, refrain from giving our immediate impact and going back to the old narratives, because a lot of times we're trying to build relationships and engage in dialogue, and dialogue means back and forth, a current exchange, and through that, our consciousness is raised. We don't want to offend, disrespect, and assault each other in the process. And this is one more thing. The playbook that's already, and narrative's already been written, everybody's wise to the game. So if you get caught in an old position and someone says, hey, I already know what you're about to do, because we've already studied this, we've seen it play out, people are moving beyond that very quickly, and you want to remain on the cutting edge or the front line of being a part of the solution and not someone being put in the back, where there's a sense of you're just like you've always been, therefore you're dismissed. So, and that'll make sense. If it makes sense, it makes sense. If it doesn't, it will at some point. So those are some of my thoughts and reflections. I guess we can have a few seconds to, if anybody has any questions or thoughts, or if we want to move right into soon to be Dr. Jones.
Yeah, I think we should open up if there are any reactions to what we've seen play on the national, actually world stage, in the midst of this pandemic. This is what my mom said to me. Our dogs and water hose moment. So to see a Black man killed on a video that has gone viral across the world is what my mom views as the way that Black people and others felt when they first were, showing dogs and water hoses attacking Black people. Really, these have been going on obviously for centuries. However, to see it via TV at the time was something that was unconscionable. So we're in that space, I think, is a good way of describing that right now.
And one more thing, just to throw in there, Ms. Bland, is, and let's be really thoughtful about what that means, right? We're literally watching the murder of people consistently on television over and over and over again. That's not only dehumanizing to the person, but it desensitizes us to what the value of that life is. So all the things that we're talking about, and this is where we're moving towards and figuring out plans for, is recognizing how deep this stuff is, right? To have watched and witnessed lynchings, where before it was pictures, and we've probably always seen the iconic pictures of lynchings, right? Everybody's standing around and they're lynching. There's a kid with eating popcorn while a body is hanging from a tree, right? Now we're seeing at the Wendy's, someone there for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. All these things, these are things that are in our psyches as a community, as a culture, that we have to undo and still feel the anxiety and terror of watching a person die, right? And that's the level of where we really have to own this and recognize this is not just, oh, there's another one, there's one here, there's there, and that's how it's said and spoken about cavalierly. But these are human lives and people who are dying and being murdered, and we're witnessing it on a regular basis constantly. And we have to be able to protect ourselves mentally. People send notes and say, hey, here's the video and text, and you hit the button and it's someone being killed. We have to recognize that this is something that is sacred and that we have to honor in some way. So I encourage us to, as we engage, to remain sensitive and protect ourselves from the images, from the things that are happening, because it does have an impact that makes us less responsive and reactionary, when this should put us into a point of outrage or terror to watch someone be murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll stop there.
Yes.
Questions?
If you want to jump in, just either write it in the chat or raise your hand. We'll unmute you. So, what's up with Karen? All right. So, I've had many of my friends. In fact, I've asked a couple of people whose name happens to be Karen if they knew about this meme that's been going around for some time, actually, in the Black community. I don't know how long the nation has been accustomed to hearing this. I know maybe a year ago it was Barbecue Becky, then it was Permit Patty, and this and now we have the terminology a Karen. I wanted to talk about that today because if you Google what is a Karen,
Mm-hmm.
it will say that it's a term for a person perceived to be entitled or demanding beyond the scope of what is considered appropriate or necessary. And a common stereotype is that of an American middle-aged woman who displays aggressive behavior when prevented from getting her way. And such women are often depicted as demanding to, quote unquote, speak to the manager. And so the term Karen is similar in some ways to the term Becky in that it describes a racist white woman, but the Karen type is more than merely privileged, arrogant, and dismissive of people of color, but she's also portrayed as verbally and or physically abusive. So with that, with that definition in mind, I'd like to introduce Dr. Emerald Jones. Dr. Jones is a current professor at the college focusing on sociology and also criminal justice. She is working on her PhD at Howard University focusing on these areas as well, and she currently holds a master's degree in sociology and a bachelor's degree in psychology. Her research, which focuses on mass incarceration, social inequality, racial discrimination, and occupational inequality, explores how race and gender play a major role in the judicial system. Dr. Jones.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I hope everyone's doing okay today, and I'll just jump right in. So when we talk about white privilege and what's up with Karen, you got to take a step back, right? Because you have to first look at the system, and how did it get to where we are now, as far as an individual thinking that she has a certain privilege to use certain behaviors, and not only those behaviors, but that if the police were to be contacted or called, they're going to initially go with how she feels instead of a person of color. So I want to take a step back to 1865. After the ending of slavery, we had what we called is how we're going to transform to where we are now. You had the convict lease system, and you had where there individuals of color, they did not want to give them the proper reparations or help them proceed. So what they did was they wanted to make a system to keep them entangled and to keep that privilege of, I am in charge and you are beneath me. And it's a dehumanization thing, because even though there's this concept of we're free, we're not necessarily free. So when we think about white privilege, it's been immersed in the system. And because it's been immersed in the system, it is now implicit bias, which is unconsciousness of the things that you hear of when you think of a Black person, or you think of someone that, oh, you're doing something just because of your color. So when we think of that, we have to go and say, okay, how are we moving forward as far as white privilege? Think of the criminal justice system. Think of all those things when we look at low-level criminals, which the criminal justice system makes up maybe 2.1 million people of color who are incarcerated, but they're incarcerated for low-level offenses, and those offenses are due to certain things. And why is that even important to where we are now? That's important because police can be contacted for something, and that could increase the likelihood and chances of arrest, sentencing, incarceration, and the taking of someone's life due to someone like Karen. And that could have happened to that young gentleman who very intellectual, has a good background, went to a prestigious school, but none of that mattered because of his color. And those types of things are what's affecting the system, because it doesn't matter who you are or how intelligent you are, your color trumps everything else. So when we think of Karen, we think of things as using your privilege and your power and being able to rip or strip someone, even like myself, of the things that I've worked hard for to get to where I am, just because I'm a Black woman. And so that has also been immersed by the way that we see the policies, we see the things that's going on. And my question that I always ask when we think about Karens, we think about white privilege, we think about all the things that are entangled in where we are now, especially now when I just get on social media and I see that there's been someone lynched outside of a grocery store. There's no video footage. There's no anything. What are the solutions to the Karens? So we're talking about Karens, we're talking about white privilege, we're talking about the systematic biases and discriminations and stereotypes, but what are the solutions to that? Because now we have the memes of the Karens, but we don't have just one Karen, we have multiple Karens. And now with police brutality and all the things that are going on, it seems as though it's getting worse. The more we protest, the more we go out and we're fighting for our rights and we're fighting for those different things. Every day you get on there, someone's been killed. A Black woman or a Black man, or even let's look at Breonna Taylor. We still have no convictions or arrest for the individuals that killed the young lady who was sleeping in her bed. But we had a no knock. We created a ban for no knock warrants, but there's no one arrested. So those are Karens. Karens, in my opinion, in my educated opinion, yes, it's a white woman that we looked at, but it's a mindset. So a Karen could also be someone else. A Karen could be a Caucasian man as well. That mindset is why we are where we are now, because that mentality that I am above you, you are still inferior to me, and I'm going to call the police because I'm going to lie. They're going to believe me. That's a privilege that has been ingrained since the beginning of time. And I started with slavery because I wanted to showcase that just because slavery ended on record, it did not end for people of color. It transformed and evolved into the system of where we are now. And as you can see, the system trickling down, the criminal justice system, education, housing, all the opportunities that we're supposed to have, we still one charge that could ruin our lives. So that could have ruined the gentleman's lives who's a bird watcher. That could have ruined his life, and he could have lost all of his rights because of someone, a Karen. And that's what I want to get to. What are we going to do? What is the solution to the Karen? Because we understand what privilege is. We understand the ideology of it, but what's moving forward and how are we going to resolve that? That's all I'm saying. Thank you. Any questions?
Nicole?
I don't have a question. I have a comment. Particularly with this topic, I just recently relocated from New Jersey to Maryland. So moving in has been exciting with moving as usual. But I had a very recent experience with the next door neighbor who had this assumption that she had the right to question why I was moving into the neighborhood. And immediately my husband and I were like kind of joking about how we just threw out, oh, here we go, in our neighborhood, questioning us about how many people were in our household, questioning why we were moving to this neighborhood. And I think it puts some of us in very precarious predicaments because of the proximity. So this is going to be my new neighbor. So I have to filter how I communicate. I can't become angry because I have to live next door to this individual. But she doesn't have a right to question why I'm moving to the neighborhood. And the fact that she feels as though she has that right was very frustrating and even dehumanizing to some degree. And that's in a neighborhood where a couple doors down, there's signage on people's door that says Black Lives Matter. So that's a more, I would call this a more woke neighborhood than what I'm accustomed to, because you have that mixture of thought processes, but we don't have that space. We don't have that, like when I think of Karens, I think there's an assumption that they deserve to be protected. But as a Black woman, I don't deserve to be protected from interrogation. And I don't deserve to be safe in my own space. And my question should have been to her, why do you feel it's okay for you to question me? But I didn't feel safe enough to do that.
Nicole, I think you raise a great point. There's a couple of messages in the chat that refers to this, and I want to address that. One is, how do our participants who identify as a person of color feel about calling someone a Karen? I think that's the message in the chat. And so calling someone a Karen. So for me, that is not something that I would typically say. This has become thrust into the national conversation, which is why I'm raising it in our Let's Talk discussion for today. So it's not like Black or brown people go around saying, oh, that's Karen, that's Karen, that's a Karen. But because because it has now become sort of shorthand for describing a racist type of behavior. And be that as it may, in terms of picking that name versus any other name, it's the concept, right? So this is not a Sharon Bland terminology to pick out this name Karen. This is something that has been thrust upon the national conversation. So that's why I wanted to raise it up for a conversation in this space. So
I have a statement and a question for Emerald. So one, it's funny, the term Karen didn't come from an academic space. This came from the streets. I heard about Karen from my 11-year-old daughter and my 14-year-old daughter, I guess, for not lack of a term for a relationship I have with her, where this is a conversation, they came from the streets. This has been out in the community at elementary and middle school. The issue is the rest of the world is just getting to it. And so a lot of the things that we're hearing, there's never been a conversation about white women being able to false accuse people of color and white men doing the same thing. Just that is a term that became popular and now it's in popular media, period. There's never, if you thought that we didn't know what was happening before, then you're blinded to the fact that we already been calling y'all a bunch of other names. So the thing isn't that this is new, it's just that we're talking about it and it's brought to the public consciousness. One of the questions that I had for Emerald, which came from the chat, was can you describe the role of Karens and Chads, which is the same as the male form of that, white privilege, and how it resulted in the mass incarceration of Black people? So I think that's one of the comments, you touched on it, but it came back from the chat. So can you speak to that a little more as well?
Yes, because when you think of, and I talk about mass incarceration, I bring that in so that you could see that it's a domino effect, right? So that's how it starts. The Karen, which is a way for, I would say, the Black community to conceptualize, again, here we are again, there's something else going on, and we try to conceptualize it, so we give it names to understand it. And I've noticed that we give things names to figure out this is another way that we're being mistreated. It's moving forward. But when you think about how it gets to mass incarceration, the police get called. What happens after the police get called? If you can see the examples of what's going on now, you don't have to do anything and you can get arrested. And the thing about not getting arrested, now we have to worry about, are we going to live when we get arrested? Are we going to make it to incarceration? Because see, now we're not even making it to incarceration because we're being killed while we're being arrested for nothing. So if the police would have came and stopped the gentleman, he didn't guarantee you, Karen would have been the top priority of maintaining, well, what's wrong? What happened? But because we're videotaping and now we're in the era of social media, everything's getting placed out. See, this has been going on. We've put a name to it now, but it's all been here. But now that we're in the technology phase of things and the technology is it's booming, we're recording things saying, hey, this is what's going on. So if Karen would have never been recorded, it still would have been going on. It still would have been happening. We're just now seeing it because now people are tired of the Karens and the Chads and the arrests and the convictions without anything. And see, if you take it even back, the riots 1992, Rodney King. That was one of the things like, oh my God, this is what's happening. What is the system going to do? The system still didn't do anything, even though we had footage of the police brutality. So now it's like the footage and the media is the only thing that protects us, but you have to also think that police are the first initial contact before you get to incarceration. That gentleman or get arrested. So that gentleman could have easily been arrested. His life could have easily been changed with a charge that he did nothing for. And that's how we get to incarceration. And that's how you also get to where we are as far as why we are disproportionately represented within the penal population. So when you think of that, you have to think of everything coming around full circle. And those are all pieces that play into the Karens and the Chads. And that's what I mean when I talk about Karen, because Karen can infect and ruin someone's life by just a lie. And that's why it's important to mention that so that you can see the overall effect of what Karen has on society and especially people of color in society today.
Well, thank you for that response. I'm going to go ahead and move on now to Dr. Frances Howell, and I am going to start with a brief video.
This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good afternoon. My name is Diane Stewart.
I'm sorry.
I am associate professor of religion and African American.
Sorry about that. Okay, here we go.
Black children through a school system that could garner no more than 10 points, an entire generation. And then, entire generation. Protect and serve, yeah, because I'm kindling. kindling. Let's talk about the police. We know that the police are here to protect and serve. Yeah, because I'm going to be doing this throughout, because there's a kind of hymn book that we sing from, right? We know it, right? We know the police are here to protect and serve. So in this protect and serve, except in Ferguson, they looked at that Black population as revenue generators. So you're doing 26 and a 25, boom, ticket. I don't think you fully stopped at that stop sign. Boom, ticket. Ah, looks like you've got a broken tail light. Boom, ticket. And this is a working class neighborhood. And so when you start hitting this neighborhood, this community with $50 tickets, $25 tickets, $80 tickets, $100 tickets, and you begin to think about what that means. You pay the ticket or you pay your rent. You pay the ticket or you keep food on the table. You keep the lights on. There's not disposable income here. When you don't pay that ticket, the next time you're doing 26 and a 25, because now there's a warrant out for your arrest. Then you are jailed. And then the entire criminal justice process of fines and court fees and bail are all pulling from this working class Black community. By the time when Ferguson blew, those fines and those tickets accounted for 25% of Ferguson's operating budget. 25%. And let me be really clear. Justice was not blind. Justice, in fact, had, what did you call it? Had LASIX. Because justice was, so if the police would happen to stop somebody white and try to hand them a ticket and go, ooh, sorry, not you. Or if the police officer handed somebody white a ticket and somebody white went in to go then pay the ticket, it was like, what are you doing? I'm trying to pay this ticket, and to tear up the ticket. So you're getting this massive extraction from the working class Black population in Ferguson. Kindling. And so as I began to think about this kindling, I began to think about the way that white rage worked. White rage is not about visible violence. We often think of rage as visible. We often think of racism as this visible thing. But white rage is subtle. It is corrosive. It operates through the state legislatures, through Congress, through the judiciary, through school boards. It cloaks itself in legalities. And so I set out, and so because it's so quiet, it's so subtle, you don't see it. And so I set out to blow graphite onto that fingerprint, to be able to trace white rage throughout time, not all the way back to time immemorial with the dinosaurs, but at least up to the Civil War, all the way through to 2016. And one of the things that became clear to me as I started thinking through how white rage works, it became clear to me that the presence of Black people was not the trigger for white rage. There's that stun, almost what you talking about, Willis? Look. It is the presence of Black people with ambition. The presence of Black people with drive. The presence of Black people with aspirations. The presence of Black people who achieve. It's the presence of Black people who refuse to accept their subjugation. The presence of Black people who demand their rights.
So, with that in mind, I'd like to bring Dr. Raphael Howell to the forefront to have a quick conversation about this video. I think you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, that's
the author of White Rage, and her name is Carol Anderson. And so she, as you heard, she talks about the socioeconomics of racism. Yeah, there's a obvious racism, there's an in-your-face racism, there's a murdering of other Black racism, very overt. But there's also a mechanism that drives racism that is about the economics. The penal system operates on the basis of economics. And so Blacks are subjugated to that system in order to make money. She talks later in this tape about the economics, specifically in Ferguson, and how there's a large, significant percentage of the revenue that comes from incarcerating, stopping, fining, ticketing, etc., Black people in that community. So we have to be aware of the dynamics of racism. All of it is not overt. Some of it is very covert. And if we're going to affect change, we're going to have to do more than a scaling off of the outer layers. We're going to have to take a deep dive and change some things. And some of those changes are going to have to come about from taking a look at unconscious bias. And we go to the next slide, Sharon.
Okay. Yep.
Biomedical editor for Health Science Communications. But a lot of America was introduced to him this week as a Black man who asked a woman in New York Central Park to leash her dog while he was trying to bird watch. And it was met with this response.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to me.
And I'm taking a picture and calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life. There is an African-American man. I'm in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. I'm being threatened by a man in the ramble. Please send the cops immediately.
So joining us from New York is Christian Cooper, and from LA, his sister Melody, who posted the video that went viral. Welcome to both of you. I mean, you're walking in Central Park on Monday, you come across a woman and her dog, and the dog is not leashed, supposed to be on a leash. So take us from that moment forward.
Sure. The Ramble is an area of Central Park which is protected because there's a lot of wildlife there and a lot of delicate plantings. So it's posted all over the Ramble that...
We can go to the other example of a Karen in San Francisco.
Okay.
This happened recently as well.
Some of the injustice that we've been seeing is not okay. And as a young person, you gotta listen to our perspective. Our voices need to be heard.
This is what happens when whole communities of people have not received justice. And the pain is real and it's legitimate.
A riot is the language of the unheard because enough people aren't listening to the unheard. And if we listened to them and took their concerns seriously, forget the need for a riot, there wouldn't be the opportunity for a riot.
Repeat after me. George Floyd. Breonna Taylor. Mario Woods.
You have a pandemic, then you have these protests. This reminds people of the 60s and the chaos, the discord and distrust throughout the country.
My heart has been heavy. Yes, I'm the mayor, but I'm a Black woman first.
People that are standing up for people especially the young African Americans, they're just tired. They want equality, that they want justice, and I understand.
Two 19-year-old childhood friends coming together to create a movement. 15,000 people united with one goal.
To have a solidarity march. When I saw that it was, this whole field started getting filled up, I knew it was something that was real legit.
You want to go to the next one?
Young people are underrated. I think that we're very powerful.
I've been heartened to see those in law enforcement who recognize, let me march along with these protests.
Work with us. Encourage us to find ways as a community to go through this discord in a manner that's peaceful, in a manner that may be unfiltered, but doesn't involve violence.
We have a simple message. You are not alone today.
ABC7 presents From Anger to Action, a Bay Area conversation.
Yeah, that's it. You're the. Let's go to chosen targets. The second clip is an illustration of the same phenomenon, the Karen. And again, as Dr. Brown said, it's not intended or to be insulting or racist to call someone a Karen. It's something that was generated in the common vernacular, and I had to get on board to understand what that term even meant. But it refers to this assumption that you have a privilege to subjugate, cause harm to someone else. And the lynchings of post-Reconstruction, emancipation, all the way up to modern times, the current events that are occurring, the police killing Black men, all of these are representations of racism from earlier on to current times. Frances Welsing was a Black psychiatrist. She died within the last 3-4 years. And she had what's known as crest theory in terms of underlying mechanisms of racism. And she said that the purpose of racism is to ensure white survival. So what she meant by that is there's this push-pull struggle in terms of being displaced by Blacks. You've heard the chanting of Jews will not displace us or replace us. Blacks will not replace us. And so some underlying mechanism, subconscious thoughts or activities stem from this unconscious fear of being replaced, diminished, obliterated. So that is the drive, she theorized, for racism. Then also Frantz Fanon was a revolutionary, so to speak, in this area. He was a trained psychiatrist also. He was born in Martinique and trained in France in psychiatry, served in World War I, and then later was sent by the French government to Algiers, and he participated in the Algerian Revolution once he saw what was going on in the hospitals there, where Blacks were getting poorly treated, who needed medical attention. They were in subservient roles. And so he compared that with the issue of class and race in colonial Martinique, as well as what he was experiencing in Algiers. And so he joined the Algerian Revolution and sought to provide some freedom from the oppression of the colonizing there. So that's some of the dynamics that have been theorized about racism. So what do we do? First of all, we need to accept that there's a drive for life. And so we all have that. And some of that unconscious bias is rooted in striving for existence. A child first born, as soon as he comes out of the womb, the first thing he does is grasp for air, life force. So we all have it, but we have to recognize it and accept it without defenses. And sometimes you see this denial that seems to be impermeable to accepting that this is something that's human nature. But we need to understand it if we're going to control it and if we're going to provide some solutions that work. And so there are legal, social, and educational areas that really need to shift based on understanding the underlying mechanisms. In other words, you can't legislate to change if people don't understand the dynamics of the racism drive. So that's going to be very important as we strategize for change. But I have to say, all in all, that I'm very optimistic because I do see some positive things going on. People are more free to love. We're free to love in various ways. And so I think there's hope. The couple, I was really touched by the couple, the interracial couple that was married on the anniversary of the Love decision, Love versus Virginia. And if we could see just a little bit of that.
We actually are running out of time. So I'm
going you probably saw that, but it was very inspiring to see that couple actually choose to have their wedding done in the shadow of the Supreme Court on the day commemorating the Loving versus Virginia decision, Supreme Court decision. So I think if we get to a point where we don't have to legislate humanity, that is where we need to be. And I think we're headed in that direction. So I have hope that we will soon not have to legislate humanity.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to move on to Professor Carl Smith, who is a professor of history and political science here at the college. He has his master's degree in political science with a specialization in international relations, and has taught ESL and EFL courses in Mexico, Switzerland, and Boston, and history and political science courses at community colleges since 1996. Professor Smith.
Hi, can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, all right. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope this comes together for you all. As my distinguished colleagues were talking, I was taking notes and I don't want to repeat what they were saying. So I'm going to try to skip around with some of the things that I had been thinking about. Especially Dr. Jones, I want to thank you for talking about the touched on the history things. I don't think we need to go further into that. And I appreciate what Dr. Brown and Raphael Howe were saying about some of the social and psychological structures around racism. So I don't think I need to go there. So I'm just going, in my limited time, if I may, I'll just focus on the call to defund the police, and then perhaps bring up one other issue that's, I think, is fairly provocative that I've been thinking about. So defund the police is really kind of a shorthand for trying to rectify where our money has been going for the last few years. Coincidentally, I was just reading an article in the Baltimore Magazine just this past weekend, and it was talking about how the city of Baltimore Parks and Recreation Program has been flat budgeted, means level budgeted, no increases for the last 30 years. Meanwhile, the Baltimore Police Department has had their budget tripled. So when people talk about defunding the police, I think there's a lot of that is is going on there. Is like, well, we've been funneling all of our money to the police when maybe we should go back to looking at some of these other things. It's happening across the country. The police have been the people who are now in charge of dealing with substance abuse, dealing with homelessness, dealing with people who have mental illness. Well, shouldn't people who know about housing be in charge of helping with homelessness? Shouldn't people who know about substance abuse be dealing with the people who are, abusing substances? How strange it is in our society, we become accustomed to the idea of police responding to a drug overdose, right? So you got to think about that. Should somebody with a badge and a gun respond to what's basically a medical problem, right? Shouldn't there be somebody who's like familiar with how to get somebody into rehab? Shouldn't that be the response? But that's where we are for the last few years. So I think that's what's going into that call. The other thing on a national level is very interesting. Under President Obama, there were these things called consent decrees. And what the consent decree did was they would go into communities like Ferguson, Missouri, like Minneapolis, like Baltimore, where there had been experience of police being abusive, police brutality, things like that. And the consent decree gave the federal Department of Justice some authority to fix those programs and come up with a repair solution, point by point. Do this, don't do that, right? Somebody mentioned Ferguson earlier. The consent decree told the Ferguson that you cannot be funding your county police departments and your county budget by fining people. That's ridiculous. That gives the police an incentive to stop everybody and pile up tickets and pile up the fines. How absurd. The consent decree said, stop that. Stop doing that. In addition, there's a voluntary reform program that's been going on for a few years where police departments could, on their own, work with the federal authorities to say, we need to fix our problems. I believe Chicago is doing that. And then there was also under Obama this program to try to limit the use of military grade weapons that were going to our police forces, right? So when I was a kid, many years ago, the police, I grew up in Detroit, the police didn't have all the heavy gear that we see the police have now. When there was the riots in '67, they had to call in the National Guard. Now, the police have all the equipment that back when I was a kid, the National Guard only had, the military only had. They've got the armored troop transportation device. They have all the extra riot gear. I went down to Black Lives Plaza on Sunday and saw that they had the troop carrier there. It looked like something from the streets of someplace in Afghanistan or Baghdad, but it's on the streets in Washington, D.C. So all those things, the consent decrees, the limit on military grade weapons, voluntary reform programs, efforts to fix the problems we have. Guess what? Election comes in 2016, President Trump comes in, he ends all those programs, right, or limits them. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, one of the first things he did was try to remove the consent decrees programs. So let's get rid of those, right? Limited them to the point where they're basically invisible now. Reverse the decision on the military grade weapons so they can get military grade weapons all, and as well as they were before. And ended the voluntary reform programs. So those are very practical things that should be done, and that's what I think is embedded when people talk about defund the police. That's where that comes from, right? It's like I'm seeing police with bigger and better guns and bigger and better weaponry. Meanwhile, my kids don't have a recreation center to go to, right? Or I know somebody who's having problems with drugs and they can't get into a substance abuse program, right? So those are the things that come from that. And then I think I just have a minute or two to put another idea out there, which has been rolling around in my mind, is the role of violence in these uprisings that we've been seeing. And I got into this because I was listening to a journalist professor from Northwestern talk about how proportional violence is something we generally accept, especially in international fields. We talk about just bello, it's a just war. What is a just war? It's proportional, it's proportionate, and it's directed, focused at wherever the cause of the conflict started. So in other words, you don't try to blow up the entire country. You may blow up a military barrack, or you may attack a terrorist cell, something like that. That's generally accepted. So if you take those same ideas and apply them to the African-American communities and where people are having uprisings, you know, an attack on a police station where the violence came from that police station kind of makes sense. And it's kind of ethical, right? Especially if you've exhausted all other means to address that problem. You tried kneeling, that didn't work, right? You tried trying to elect Black officials, that hasn't helped, right? You tried to reform the police, that didn't work. So what's left, right? A direct and maybe the answer at that point is, unfortunately, a direct and proportional act of violence. Just go back to 9/11. When the United States was attacked in 9/11, the international community accepted the need to attack Al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan, right? There was no call that was somehow immoral, right, based on that attack. You could, and that's, for the moment, we have to, not look at all the history of American imperialism. That's another big, long conversation. But for the moment, just focusing on that attack, that was considered a just response. However, when the focus of the attack was extended to Iraq, and President Bush said we have to go, get Saddam Hussein, a large part of the international community said, we're not with you on that. That is not directly, that's got nothing to do with 9/11. It's not proportionate. So if you apply those same standards to what we see in our communities, maybe, just maybe, and I'm not convinced of it myself, it is something that's rambling around in my head, is maybe, just maybe, what we're seeing is when you see a police station that's being attacked or being held hostage, or in the case of Seattle, it's been sort of, I guess, closed down in that zone they've created, you're maybe seeing a direct and proportional response that's legitimate. And that's all I have to say. So
thank you for that. We're gonna hold our questions to the end because I want to get to the economist on this call, Dr. Rupa Das and Dr. Shah Meravi. So let me just share a little bit about both of them. They're both faculty members at Montgomery College, and because we're short on time, I will let them just dive right on into it.
Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. So thank you, Professor Smith. He kind of explained to us the topic of defunding and what defunding means. And I was telling somebody that just like every subject has its vocabulary, I think we are now getting into the stage where we are defining the vocabulary for movement. And one of that is defunding the police. And what does it mean? Well, it definitely does not mean $0 going to the police. It also does not mean that there is no policing to keep people safe. That's not what we are talking about. But defunding the police means that bringing about some structural change and maybe restricting additional funding that's going towards the police. That can be one meaning. And we know that, you know, public funding, it's not overflowing. The county government, the state government, they're not overflowing with funds. So given the limited fund, what is the best use of that fund? Should we go buy guns for the police, get them more militarized, or how should we use it? So as an economist, economists always think of the best use of resource. So if there is, say, $1 in the public budget, how is that $1 going to be used? And if I put it in one use, let's say I put it for policing, then what is the additional benefit I get from that, and what is the additional cost of that? That's what economists would decide before they put $1 in funding somewhere. And so let me loop back to the example of Karen in Central Park, right? The woman called the police. So the police came, although in this case, the police came a little later after everybody has been dispersed. But was it the best use of police resource? You have funded the police, the woman calls the police, and police shows up. Is it the best use of that resource? Similarly, think about the situation of Rashad Brooks, who got shot in the parking lot of Wendy's, right? He has fallen asleep in the car. He was intoxicated, he had fallen asleep in the car, and then somebody called the police on him. Is it the best use of using our policing resource that the police, then armed police shows up? So these are some questions you have to think. And I was listening to a podcast from Alex Vitale, the person who wrote the book End of Policing. By the way, that book is now free to download. I didn't know that, but it's free to download now. So he was talking about that he was talking to some police officers, and he asked them, okay, so you are doing this policing. Would you have liked to be in another job, say, for example, playing basketball with kids, you know, teaching kids basketball, or in some mental health facility helping people? And they said, yeah, but there is no job there, but the police department is hiring constantly. So again, that brings us to the issue of funding, right? Where are we putting our funding? Why aren't we putting funding in places where, you know, there can be jobs created and people can go there? And I think recently, Professor Smith gave that example of Baltimore. I think recently the LA mayor has also done similar thing. He has taken funds and put it towards housing and community development and that kind of thing. So when we talk about defunding, that's one point. The other point as an economist that I think about all the time is that, you know, police is a security institution, right? We need that. Look at El Salvador. One reason why their economic growth is so low is because their security institution is not working properly, right? So we need a proper institution. No, nobody doubts that. However, we do need accountability in that institution. what kind of an institution is it if there is no accountability, right? The police has been given qualified immunity. They cannot be prosecuted. They can get away with murder. That's not a good institution. So as an economist, I think for economic progress for this country, we need proper institution, proper working of the police institution. The other thing I think this defunding the police makes us think is that we need to rethink policing. I think that's what defunding the police means, that you rethink policing, and when you come up with policing policies, try to temper it with understanding of poverty and inequality. And I'm thinking of the example of Eric Garner, right, 2014. He was selling loose cigarettes, right? And there is perfect economics for him to do that, because you can buy cigarettes at a lower price in another state, then you go to Staten Island, sell it loose, right? It's illegal. He had his brush with police several times. But why is he doing that in the first place, right? Think about that. Were there other opportunities for him? So when we think about policing, we need to put it in broad framework of poverty, inequality, job creation, and then think about policing. So, so I think from economics perspective, those are the questions. And I think it's a very legitimate question to ask about defunding the police, because you know, at least since 2014, after Eric Garner's death, and there are dash cams, right? The police has dash cams. So people are seeing things in video, but nothing is happening, right? So that's why this additional step that people are wanting, they want accountability, they want more, and they want the funding to be properly used. So, so yeah, with that, I'll stop. And
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Das. Dr. Maravi? You're on mute.
Let me unmute myself. Good afternoon. I think my colleague mentioned a little bit defunding. And, you know, let me try to pinpoint a number of issues here. We're talking about resource allocation. And this is the first thing that we emphasize, even in our principal course. But overall, for policymakers are very aware of the fact that resources are limited, and as to which direction it should be directed to could have an impact on what will happen to the society at large. I think if you look at it, the issue of policing, United States have always been accused of being hypocrites. I think you look at police brutality, it's not only a phenomenon that exists here, it exists all over the world. If you look at the issues of treatment of minorities beside the Black people in this country, as well as in other parts of the world, you will see that the atrocities that are committed by police are common throughout the world. The recent case of a person who had autism, who was shot in Jerusalem, and also when you look at a number of cases in Australia of Aborigines who were slaughtered by police, are other example of police brutalities. Now, what we need to do here is, and we are at the midst of discussing what needs to be done with the police, is to look at the resource allocation. Now, we have data trying to tell us what do states and localities spend on police protection. This is, if you look at it, the data, the role of the state is fairly minimum. Yes, they do give resources, but the resources of the states are directed toward the state patrol. And most of the resources, about 86% of the resources of localities and spendings are designed and are designated in the area of police protection. So you see in the United States a decentralized system where localities are actually they are given the authority to be able to go ahead and play with the resources that they collect and trying to bring about protection. Now, and then obviously when you look at this data also, nearly all police spending, if you look at the recent data that I looked at, this is again from Census Bureau, 97% in 2017 were spent toward operational costs. Now, when you look at also that the issue of the state spending, as I said to you, is locality will have to be able to play a role, and federal government role is very, very minimum. And some other statistics a lot of people don't like, but I'm going to spit it out to you to get an idea, and then I'll come to you what needs to be done, looking at the specific types of local government. And a statistic shows that police spending accounted for 13% of municipal direct government expenditure, 9% of township expenditures, and 8% of country expenditure. So when you look at it, again, there's a substantial amount of expenditure that really occurs, and it's funneled by mostly localities, but also state. Now, if you look at it also another way, that we look at it, the local expenditure over time for different localities, and trying to look at it here also over a 10-year period. From 1977 to 2017, then state and local government spending on police, it went up from 42 billion to 115 billion. Now, this is this is inflation adjusted in 2017, inflation adjusted dollars. However, if you look at the percentage of direct government expenditure, police spending has not increased that significantly, has remained constant at just about 4% for the past 40 years. This is substantiated by data. Now, if you look at also another issue, I think here is also very important to look at it, how and why does spending differ across states, as it does. So if you look at it, for example, in Chicago, you will see that Chicago has spent probably about, not probably, definitely spends about 17.6% of its spending. Atlanta spends about 13% of its budget. Now, in District of Columbia, DC, close to us, spend the most per capita, per capita on police. This is, again, we look at the data, they are spending on per capita about $910. And if you look at New York is second based on the data, about $529. Alaska spent $493, and California about $487. So the lowest spending per capita occurs in the states like Kentucky. Kentucky spent $186, and West Virginia $217. And then when you look at Arkansas, $221, and Maine, $232. Now, so you're getting a picture of how the funds are really distributed and the expenditure in the police area. Then that takes us back to the issue of what communities really want. What do we really want? What are our priorities? And how do we want to stick what we have? Or should we go ahead and try to reallocate the resources, as we have done over the past 4 years, from police to other areas? Meaning whether you're looking about a homelessness issue of other expenditure in education, or increasing it in other areas that many cities need. And this is an issue that it takes us, again, that resource allocation and divesting from police department overall into the programs that a communities like. I think, again, since this is decentralized structure, each communities will have to address it. But overall, there are certain things that definitely we can do. As economists, we're always say we want to quantify benefits and quantify costs. Now, too often, what happens here is that our policymakers, in one way or another, they have information. Definitely, we have clear information about the budgetary costs, and then the potential remedy, potential cost of potential remedy. But sometimes they might not have the clear cost of inaction, or the long-term benefits of investment. So we can clearly do that. That is, we can go ahead and do the cost-benefit analysis to fill the knowledge gap in the long run, and to be able to see what a payoff is going to be if you are going to move out of resources from police protection to other areas. Now, the role of state and local officials will have to be and then somewhat obviously the federal government that the Congress has already started here is that they have to come up with some standards, standards for justice. And this is what is lacking. Standard for justice will have to be there. There has to be some standards set for safety. There has to be some standards set for anti-racist policy. There's no doubt that our police structure in one way or another, and I have experienced it as well as there are many anecdotal but also data-driven evidence that shows that it is not one rotten apple. There are many rotten apples within the system. Yeah. And those will have to be, in one way or another,
eradicated
out of the system. That is simple. Set a national standard for police behavior. You cannot eliminate chokeholds. That is crazy that that Senate does not want to consider chokeholds. I mean, there has to be no compromise in certain areas. And federal government will have to play a role in trying to set a standard for the nation to go ahead and adhere to. And I think it's establishing, maybe in the Department of Justice, some task force that will constantly monitor, constantly investigate, constantly prosecute all these, and not give protection to those who commit criminal act and who actually bring terror on our population. And I will stop here.
Dr. Rabi, I just want to thank you so much for bringing the economics perspective and sharing with us the cost that we are spending nationwide. I think many people on this call recognize that. There was a comment in the chat, if you could give us a one-pager with those statistics I could send out to the follow-up, that would be great, because people would like to see that on paper. But I think the suffice it to say that in talking about the cost benefit of redirecting funds that are currently being spent on increasing a police state and militaristic nature of some of police forces, and I'm not going to say every police force, and to the benefit of redirecting those funds to fund things like mental health services, to fund things such as homelessness and boys and girls clubs, and we talk about the idea of, if these particular funds were funneled into these types of social services, but in the long run, we would see a decrease in the need for police intervention and violence, et cetera, and criminal behavior. So that's kind of the summation of some of the arguments around defunding the police. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank all of the panelists and all of the wonderful Montgomery College faculty members. I'd like Captain Pruitt to share with us any response that she has to hearing all of this, seeing that not only she is currently with Montgomery County Police, but also serves as a criminal justice professor at Montgomery College. And then and if you could just give us a couple minutes on that, we'll take any questions. I'll have Dr. Brown respond to those questions, and then we will wrap up for the day.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. So I took some notes while we were talking, like 4 pages of notes. And so I picked out 3 things that I wanted to actually comment on. The first, or 4. The first being the defunding of the police. So because we're in Montgomery County, let me talk very briefly about Montgomery County. The police budget in Montgomery County is only 5% of the county's budget. More than 50% of that budget goes to education in the county. So we have had to be, as a police department, very creative about how we use our money. And I would like to think that we have been on the forefront of thinking outside the box in terms of outsourcing some of the things that police have been traditionally doing in this country that are not working. For instance, having a relationship with the crisis intervention, with the crisis center, whereby we could call a crisis intervention team to come to a call to speak to someone to see if they could use their services instead of ours. In addition, we have officers who are trained in crisis intervention who can actually recognize that need, and we can sometimes send them out because sometimes things overlap. Criminal issues overlap, civil issues, and then the mental piece. And so we can send them out, and then if they need additional resources, they can call someone. In addition, we have been speaking recently about the decriminalization of homelessness. And that kind of speaks towards us having less contact with our homeless population. Us giving them citations and sending them to jail is not really working for them, except for the fact that they might get a hot meal and some place to sleep for a night. They can't pay the fines, which ends up, it's like a never-ending cycle where they can't pay the fines, so we pick them up on a warrant, they go to court, they can't pay the fine. I mean, it's over and over. So several people from the criminal justice realm in Montgomery County and social justice got together and offered the county executive several suggestions as to how we could handle those issues. There was a question in the chat about Mr. Brooks, and that's Rashad Brooks in Atlanta, who was recently killed in a police encounter. And the comment basically asked, it was kind of a simplification of the situation. Police have discretion. There are lots of things that we can do besides arrest someone. And we know that, okay? We know that. Often we become very badge heavy, and that's where our desire to complete the mission outweighs thinking about the outcome, okay? And that's part of the policing culture. That's part of being blue. Okay, I'm gonna make this arrest, I'm gonna do this, you're gonna do what I tell you. Those are the types of things that need to be addressed. So besides the fact that that situation could have been handled differently, I would like to say, as a police officer, I would never want anyone to think that Mr. Brooks was responsible for his own death. I get that he had a taser, I get that he pointed the taser, but things went awry way before we got to that point. And even after that fight on the ground, because I fought someone with a gun, I fought someone who tried to take my gun. Not at any time did I ever consider pulling my own weapon and shooting him in the back as he ran away. So I'm going to get to that in a second about police think. I really need to say this. I had an interview on CNN this morning, and I said this because I think it needs to be articulated. While people would like for us not to make this a political issue, it is very much a political issue, because, and you can disagree with where I'm about to go, and you can send me an email, as some people have done. But in this country where we have a president who calls for law and order, okay, that's dog whistle for let's go and over police Black folks. That is, we've had presidents before us who have used that phrase, and that is what typically happens. It is intentional. And so our president has now signed something today concerning police reform, but it doesn't really have any teeth. This is some good suggestions and things that I could actually get behind, like a national database of officers who are involved in misconduct, and we don't want them hired in other places. Those things are great. But the things that we need teeth on are missing, and it's going to take Congress to handle those pieces. But let me just jump back to where I was going. There are things that are happening right now federally that are not in the best interest of vulnerable and Black communities. The 1033 program, which helps police departments get military equipment, that was something that President Obama had tried to minimize, and now it's blown up again. We don't need tanks and rocket launchers. Whose neighborhood is going to get rocket launched? Consent decrees. Mr. Smith mentioned consent decrees, which are almost like gone now. They're like an endangered species in the Department of Justice right now. And we need those because that gives police departments parameters and it gives them resources which enables them to meet those parameters, okay? The Attorney General had a conversation with police officers at a police conference where he told them, basically, folks gotta respect you for you to give them good police service. You should expect to be respected, which when it really should be the other way around because it's the public that guides policing and we should be respecting the public, okay, so that we can provide the best service. And finally, our president has disrespected Black police chiefs in their cities when he visited. He visited the IAC, he's visited Chicago for the IACP conference, that's the International Association of Chiefs of Police, where they had a black police commissioner, and he talked about the man as though he didn't even live or work in the city. Then he just went to Dallas, had a conversation about police reform, and didn't invite any of the major Black police players except for one person who I guess was a Republican. So people are talking about not making it political. It's very political. It's political because it's being made political by the President of the United States. That's my opinion. Finally, recommendations. The recommendations that I have been talking about with my criminal justice and police reform peers says that there needs to be more federal, not federal, but federal involvement, or national involvement, because things need to be more consistent across the board, like use of force. Police departments all across the country are doing their own thing. They have different policies. They have different expectations. It's messy. We need to be more consistent in that area. I love the database of officers involved in misconduct. Great. We need to be more transparent. Those officers involved in misconduct, very often we can't see their employee records involving the misconduct. And then we find out years later, like we did with in Mr. George Floyd's case, that Officer Chauvin had 18 complaints. That is ridiculous. And then this recent incident where the officer has had several complaints since 2015, and all he got was a spank on the hand. That is common in policing, and it needs to stop. And so I have multiple times, and I'm going to end on this, called on my police peers and commissioners and police chiefs. It was appropriate that the chief resigned in Atlanta because nobody has any confidence in her anymore. She's a great person, but okay, what's happening in your department? And we need to call on people to make sure that they hold police officers' feet to the fire. And then I'll end on that. Thank you.
Whoa, thank you very much. I really appreciate that perspective. I mean, talk about a wrap up. So there are a number of questions. We're not going to get to them all, obviously, because we're run out of time. I apologize, but I will take some. Miss Pauline White has had her hand raised for some time. Would you please ask your question? And then I think someone else had something else for you, Sonia.
Okay.
Hi there. I'm part-time faculty in the nursing department. Thank you very much for everybody's discussions today. It's very important to be part of that, I feel. I have just a statement and then a question. I absolutely agree with you. I've had a lot of contact over my career in nursing with police, bringing patients in, and there is a tendency for them to, when I speak to them, they almost sort of feel that they are there to control the community. And my feeling for a police force is that they should come into this job to serve the community. Their role is they are being paid by the community to improve the community, to be out there to help, to look for anything they can do to improve the lives of the community that they're serving. And there tends to be the opposite for many people, that they're there just to want to control it. And that's sort of reinforced by older colleagues maybe training them. So it's how I agree with, we need federal standards that everybody is, has to abide by. I think that we need to have an external body that it can audit and have a look at issues that are not, keeping up to those standards. And the question is, but how do we get to that point? Because we have lots of conversations, we have wonderful ideas, but we seem to have the same conversation all the time. We need to have a method of moving forward. Is it the local states that have to push this forward? Is it the community in general? I can't see it's our president because because that's not going to go. How, in your opinion, do we move this forward? Because we need a starting point to get people to see, the police to see, they are there to serve and to help us. And I'm sure there are lots that do want to, but I will stop there because I can go on forever. Thank you.
Can I just make a quick comment on that? Yeah, so I was thinking that, we talked about this whole issue, and it's definitely a race issue, but it's also a power issue. And Professor White mentioned that, when she sees people this way of controlling, and I think Professor Pruitt mentioned that they're badge heavy. Right? I think that's what I heard. You said they're badge heavy. I think that's an issue, that police feels they're empowered. And I think that's the reason why, in Atlanta, that the two students who were tased, it was horrible to see that video. The two Black students were tased, and the police who were doing that were Black policemen, right? So there, it's not an issue of race. It's something else that's making them do that. And I think that's an issue of power, that police has been given this so much power, they're drunken with power almost. And then they have been given this qualified immunity. So there you go.
So if I could just speak to what you said about it not being about race, but it really is in this way.
No, I'm saying it is about race, but
no.
There are multiple,
yes,
things.
But the Black officer,
power is also an issue.
When Black officers when Black officers do those things that we typically think that only white officers might do, there is something about and I think it's called internalized racism, whereby we have now absorbed in policing the inequities and the power dynamics and the personality, and we act out in that way. Now, all the psychologists here could probably speak on that more.
You're right.
I see that a lot. And so I'm gonna let Dr. Brown jump in on that one.
I wasn't jumping in, I was agreeing and encouraging. And it is that sense of, we begin to internalize the oppressor's mentality, and then you act it out, right? So it's internalized oppression, internalized racism. And the thing that we have to think about so we talked at the beginning, right? We have to go back to the base of what the intent was. And Dick Gregory does a great piece on this, one of my favorite activists, comedians, scholars' minds, right? He talks about, in other people, police forces were never designed to protect the people. They were designed on one purpose only, which was protect the land of the landowners, right? And so it's not about policing, it's about protecting property. So no matter who you put in that position, you get those that are historically, and think about what police are asked to do. They're paid the least. They're not able to even afford to live in some of the communities they work in. They're unable to fully be engaged and educated. And so then you start having the corruption, the mentality, these oppressive mentalities working, because we're not getting, in some communities, we're not getting Professor Pruitt's across our police force. A lot of times we're getting folks who are coming from marginalized communities, even some of the white cops are coming from working class, poor families, and coming in thinking, I am now, this gives me status to oppress other people without any acknowledgement of the position of serving. It's purely about moving up closer to the wealth of the community, right? So white police officers only get power when they're accepted by wealthy white men. So that's their link to power. It's not about being able to police Black communities, because we don't care about the white cops walking around not doing a good job. But their validation is when Donald Trump, when the white landowners say, hey, you did a great job protecting my space and interrogating or going after anyone that encroaches upon that. So when we think about where do we begin, part of it is really deconstructing what do these systems do and what were they designed for. The majority of the systems that are enacting are doing exactly what they were designed for through intent. So we're looking at voting rights. Voting is not designed to get the masses of people to vote, it's to get a few people to vote to make those decisions. And so until we turn those things on our head and we really engage in, like you brought up, Ms. Pauline, that sense of where do we begin? I've seen it, I know it. Then it said, let's go back to the basics. And that's where the conversation starts. Because if not, we get caught in the contemporary issue that's happening or the phrase of the day and not recognizing this is what it's really about. So that was just I'm never going to go over Dr. Pruitt, but that's where she was at anyway.
There's an identification with the aggressor element in what you're saying, the points that you're making, definitely, and it happens. And we have to get real with that as well.
Well, thank you for that. There is a question, Captain Pruitt, for you around whether or not, and someone jump in if I get this wrong, whether or not the police unions are with you. Is whoever wrote that, can you say that out loud? I'm sorry, I can't get to it that quickly enough. Sonia, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was trying to find the question. Well, I can just talk about police unions in my opinion. So as I was mentioning politics and somebody made a comment about it in the chat. So our president recently had a roundtable at the White House about police reform. And it should be noted who was at the roundtable. And at the roundtable were police unions. Before the current president took office, the Fraternal Order of Police, the National Fraternal Order of Police, sent him a list of things that they wanted. And that list included things like to re-implement the 1033 program that I talked about that militarizes police departments. All the things that they asked for are things that, as the National Black Police Association, where I'm the chairperson, those are things we would never ask for. And we don't get invited to those conversations as an organization, although some of our Black peer organizations do, because we represent grassroots efforts. We represent our communities, and we represent Black police officers who are inside police departments trying to make change. So we don't get invited to those conversations unless we have like a President Obama in the White House who wants to hear from us. Okay, so police unions have a lot of power. To me, it's like a gang mentality where they offer you these things. You're going to be loved, you're going to be accepted, you're going to be part of a family. Mm-hmm. And I think to some extent, having been a member of the union, that you're paying money, but you may not get the services that you think that you're going to get. They say that they're about due process, but it's much more for them. It is much more than that. It's the power dynamic I spoke of earlier. We have the power to keep things just like they are, to keep the system just like it is, because they are negotiating the policy with police departments, and then they are negotiating legislation on the other end.
Sharon?
Yes.
Yes, let me make one or two observations here. With regard to the police union, if you look at it, I think the response of police union, where they condemned, I think, the killing of George Floyd, but a lot of the unions have been, in one way or another, protecting their members. I think, and this is unfortunate because if you look at at least repealing the 50A, since your Ms. Pruitt knew about that, the protection of police disciplinary record. in one way or another is giving them even more power to go ahead and do what they want to do. And the union, and to a great extent, have been extremely supportive of this particular measure for their members. And that is why I think a lot of people are saying that we need to be skeptical of so on. You cannot go ahead and hide under what the right group are telling us, and that is that we are for law and order, and we can do anything. Give us we have got a blank check here. We can do anything we want. We're not accountable, and so on. That is, I think, clearly in one way or another contributing to the behavior of the police. But another issue that we also did not discuss, I think, was the Camden, New Jersey case in point. I think if you look at the case of New Jersey, where they dismantled the police force, and the community by itself rehired on the police, they hired more people, also reduced their salary structure. We are paying the policemen a lot of money. We can go ahead and reduce their pension. Huge pension is given to them. I think the pension would have to be revisited. We could hire more people, but it would have to be from community that they were going to go ahead and mingle with a community where they will not have the power of ammunition with them, that they go ahead and try to patrol the police, as in Camden have done. And I think Camden, New Jersey is a good case in point to be visited in reforming the police.
That's what they're looking at. Many states are looking at Camden. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to say it's 1:42. We've gone over about 10 minutes or 12 minutes, so I want to be respectful of people's time. This issue, I've gotten quite a few private messages. This issue seems to be one that we want to reflect on and continue more of. I'd like to have part 3, and this will be the last of the series. On Tuesday, June 30th at lunchtime, we will be joined by Dr. Pollard at that session. And we'll also be talking about Say Her Name. And what I want to talk about there is let's not forget the police brutality against women of color.